In listening to what Commander Middleton just told us about why Graham found its way back into 252 and the rest of the suite for that matter, it was because the officers wanted it. That was his direct quote verbatim. The problem that I have is that the community does not want it. The monitor also does not want it. I would like to review what happened here. I guess it's going to be the third brief review of what happened. So the way 352, the policy on policies, is written is that a policy should go to the PPRB. When it comes out of the PPRB, it is supposed to then come to the POB. After the POB, it's been presented to the POB, it will thereafter move to the monitor and then to the chief. The reason why we're having this really significant issue is because this policy on policy that we so painstakingly developed over several months was not followed here. So what ended up happening was the policy came to us. The public made comment on the policy as it existed at that time. Then it went to the PPRB, and on 7/10, we see a draft that comes out of the PPRB that is materially changed to incorporate the Graham standard. In response to Mr. Schmiel, I was not made aware of this draft. I personally, speaking for myself, but being a member of the board, was not aware of those language changes until our last full board meeting. And so this meeting here is, in essence, a response to that, because what we're supposed to have when we get to when a policy gets to the POB is a near final draft. That way, and public comment is supposed to occur at that time. And so the opposite is what happened here with our most, arguably our most important set of policies, our use of force policies. And the issue that I had with that is that I think it rendered stakeholder, amici, community input strategies for addressing the substance of the use of force policies really ineffective, because the forum was held before the policy was completed. And so I think that, in this instance, we sort of fudged the policy, or we fudged the process, and we got a really horrible result. And I think public input was cut off at the knees because the policy came out of the PPRB after our POB meeting with material changes related to Graham. And I think that this meeting is an excellent demonstration that had all of those Graham paragraphs been in the policy that we saw, that many amici, stakeholders, members of the public would have had something to say about that language. However, there was really no good opportunity to do so. So we've had 6 parties here, and even survivors of a lethal use of force incident to come and speak against these language changes. So I think that really demonstrates that these language changes they're no small thing. And I think arguments saying that, we have the lesser standard is still in there even though Graham has now been incorporated really fall flat. I also think, we shouldn't have deviated from what 352 says we should do to work a policy through. Because I think that, what may have happened here is that we saw, at our full board meeting where we saw 252 come to us, the APOA was here. And the APOA had some time in the hours before our meeting submitted comments in writing to us that said that they wanted Graham to be in this policy. However, at that board meeting, even though they had representatives present, in fact, Mr. Sean Willoughby was here at that meeting, he did not venture up to the podium to say, by the way, we're advocating for Graham to be in this policy. So really, I believe that was a very underhanded strategy. And it was very effective because then they got to go to the PPRB and say, hey, please put Graham in, and then look at what we end up with. So on Graham, particularly to speak to the Graham standard, it is a lesser standard for the use of force than we are required to contemplate in this policy. The Graham standard imports what are, essentially subjective considerations regarding an officer's perceptions at the time of a use of force incident. That is not, that can arguably run counter to a definition of objectivity. It's kind of, the way that opinion is written is very tricky. I believe having Graham in the policy is misguided. It moves in the opposite direction of the mandates of the CASA, as well as our life-saving and integrity-preserving reform efforts. The Graham standard contains 20/20 hindsight language. And, in effect, it's been used, we've seen it case after case after case, where the result is, in 20/20 hindsight, lethal force was not necessary because a person was not posing an actual threat. But when we have this in our policy, it moves us away from requiring the type of circumspection that one must engage in to make an accurate analysis of whether or not we have an actual threat present and whether use of force is necessary. And we have several people have made comments here today that I really agree with. Primarily that Graham is for the courtroom. It's an analysis provided by the court ultimately to determine whether or not liability attaches. It analyzes whether a use of force passes a threshold of reasonableness, but it does not seek to understand what the minimal amount of force required in any developing situation may be. That's what this policy is supposed to do. And so Graham is really a ceiling for force, and this policy is supposed to be about the minimum, which is how do we get as far away from that ceiling possible. Those are two different things. Eking past constitutional muster and what is minimally required, two different things. And so Graham is not to be used prospectively. It's not for policy. The language and rationale of Graham contradicts the lesser standard we seek to use for this policy. And again, I would agree with the set of comments that said these additions are very confusing and they're going to be hard to train to, because what you have is you have first a minimum standard and then you have Graham language right after. And these are different standards. How are you going to really train to a policy that has two different standards? I think that that's confusing and it's illogical and it's inconsistent with the objectives of the community and the consent decree. And so I personally am again asking that APD abandon these Graham paragraphs in every policy in the use of force suite.
Thank you.
Thank you.